Welcome back to the Darius Gant Show. I'm your host, Darius Gant, as well as founder and CEO of Tesoro AI, where we help innovative founders and executives build AI solutions and AI teams. On this podcast, we focus on cutting-edge technology, more specifically, artificial intelligence. By getting up close and personal with the visionary AI founders and executives who are building these solutions, we understand exactly what problems artificial intelligence is solving in the real world and in business. Not to mention, we get courtside seats into exactly how AI companies are built and scaled. In this episode, we sit with Alex Weidauer, who is the co-founder and CEO of a company by the name of Rasa. Rasa provides the standard infrastructure layer for conversational AI. What that means is that his company is providing the tools to create better, more resilient contextual assistance. Alex himself was recently featured in Forbes 30 Under 30. His journey is interesting because he's a great example of pivoting until you find the right value driver for your customer base or your audience. Since inception, Rasa has been downloaded more than 10 million times. I'm sure you're gonna love this episode. There'll be a lot of takeaways that you get from the conversation with Alex. If you or your team is considering building an AI solution or scaling up your AI team, make sure you reach out to the folks here at Tesoro AI. We've assembled the leading experts in data science and machine learning. So whether we're talking about AI strategy, staff augmentation, custom software development, or data labeling, we've got a strong team here that has your back. So head over to www.tesoroai.com. All right, without further ado, let's hop into the show and chat with Alex. Alex, welcome to the show. Appreciate you taking out some time to chat with us today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me, Darius. I'm really excited about the next half an hour or so.
Absolutely. So would love to just get some background, into your background, right? Did you start with an interest in, are you one of those folks with decades of experience focused on AI? Where did the initial interest come from?
A great question. And I think I might disappoint the listeners a bit. So there was no grand vision or grand plan when actually my co-founder and I started working together, which is now about 6 years ago. And the way how we look at this now, with hindsight, is that we spent probably the first 2 years just building stuff that nobody wanted. And that didn't really include much AI ML in the beginning, tiny bit. And then I can talk more about how we actually got into chatbots. But to answer your question, no big industry experience. Actually, both of us founded Rasa, or what became Rasa, then eventually straight out of university after our master's and or PhD. So yeah, no real work experience.
Interesting. So out of university, started building software applications, not necessarily leveraging AI. When did the pivot happen and why?
So there's not one single pivot, right? I mean, in hindsight, I think now with more perspective on all of this, there's definitely one point where we went into this trajectory, which eventually became Rasa. But we actually built a lot of stuff in the first 2 years. And so we started building this unified search bar for Dropbox and Google Drive. So basically bringing together all your work tools, which we did for maybe a year or so. Realized that we actually had lots of free users for that, but nobody wanted to pay and nobody really used it a lot so that it would justify to build a whole company around it. So we ended up just stopping to work on that. And then through that, we got into what eventually then became this chatbot space. And so we did a lot of pivots and iterations there. We actually started out building a Slack bot at that time. That was before chatbots became cool, and I can talk more about that in a second as well. But
Slack bot, what's that?
So Slack, the messaging platform for Teams, right? Or Microsoft Teams nowadays, also really popular. And we basically built a bot that you can just ask questions about your data. So basically you could ask things like, how many website visitors did I had last week? And then it would go and do that query and then bring you back the response. Okay. So that's what we built initially, really more like an application, I guess, that we would go sell. And then through working on this, we realized that a lot of the infrastructure for developers that we are now working on isn't as good as we wanted it to be. But that's a whole other story. So basically lots of pivots. We actually worked on like brain scanners for a while, for a couple of weeks as well. And so basically I forgot the name of the product, but it's a brain scanner, and basically you can get some data from the API. And then we wanted to build an application that maybe like snoozes all your notifications if you're really in the flow working. Didn't work, like technology is way too early. But you might wonder, like, how does this all fit together? I mean, the honest answer is not exactly, not like a grand plan, but I think Alan, my co-founder, and we always followed what we were interested in. And both of us are very interested in making it easier to use computers, really, right? Like all of the products that we ever built fit into this narrative. And then I think conversational AI is really like the ultimate way. Maybe brain scanners is maybe the ultimate way, but at least for now, language seems to be like one of the main drivers of making it easier to use computers, which I'm really excited by.
Yeah. So like you said, it wasn't like one pivot. It was kind of built this thing, nobody wants to buy it. Next idea, built this thing, probably not the best commercial product. Next idea, you know what? We're building a lot of we've seen a lot of our pain points over time. Let's build some tools that actually serve some of those pain points that we've had in our building process. Is that kind of because I want to better understand what Rasa is doing, right? And it sounds like a lot of basically supporting folks who want to build conversational AI capabilities, right? But if you could just give us some better detail. I'm probably not doing the best job of explaining it, but would love to hear. I would love to hear from the creator what you guys have built.
Sure. Let me maybe start with the problem that we tried to solve when it was just the two of us, and because I think that also explains quite well into like how Rasa is used these days. So like in 2016, this messaging platform opened up their platform for people to build bots. Then Facebook Messenger came around, and some of your listeners might remember that time. Everyone was talking about how chatbots will be the new apps. And so it was crazy, right? Like we started this meetup group in Berlin, and we had like 100 people signed up in 2 hours for it. And it was just like insane. Everyone wanted to do chatbots. And Alan and I, as I said earlier, built a couple of those and then realized that they're actually pretty hard to build. And so we just ended up building some tooling for ourselves so we can build this like data bot, this like bot that we were building on Slack. And then we talked to all these other developers, and they seem to have the same problems. And so we ended up really just open sourcing like a small piece of what we built. And then we got so much interest and so much traction that we realized, holy shit, seems to be like huge demand for something like this. And then we really thought about how can we support that growing community in a better way. And then the logical conclusion for us was to really build an infrastructure company around that. So like, how can we teach other developers to build great assistants with our software? At the same time, we also believe that, and still today, 4 years later, there's so much more progress that needs to be made on the technology side, right? Like lots of research. And I mean, since then, like NLP exploded as a field with like BERT and GPT-3 and like all of those large language models, for example. But that will continue to happen, right? I mean, if anything, this won't slow down, this pace of innovation. And that's really what the Rasa community in the end, I think, is about, right? We're now having like over 10 million downloads worldwide from developers of all places in the world, all countries, all languages, building all sorts of applications, which you can go into a little deeper in a second as well. But basically, these people want to build better assistants, right? So that's what brings everyone together. And we as a company also always say we haven't figured it all out either, right? We put out some ideas there, the community uses it, improves it, and then we iterate on it. And I think it has been a successful recipe over the last few years.
Yeah. And you mentioned there was this boom of folks who wanted to build conversational AI chatbots, right? A lot of them failed. And there were a lot of companies out there that was kind of their first trial with AI. What would you say is the primary reason when someone builds a chatbot or conversational AI tool that it doesn't, or maybe there's not one reason, but maybe kind of a handful. What would you say is the one or a few reasons why these things don't work out for some folks?
I think when I compare now, like to maybe the time 4 years ago, I think what really changed is that all the hype is gone, as in people having a solution and looking for a problem kind of hype. So a lot of people talked about in the early days, like we'll see like conversational commerce and basically buying any goods really through conversation. And that happens, but it doesn't happen as much as people thought 4 years ago. And so I think what really happened is like initial hype, especially in the tech industry, really vanished. And now you see actual really large companies, kind of the traditional Fortune 500, Global 2000 types of businesses, really seeing that as a way for them to improve their customer experience, either inside their mobile app, maybe also as part of their contact center, in all these different touch points that they have with their millions of customers. And those seem to be the projects that really succeed and are really thriving also at this point in time. And not so much I think smaller projects, like lots of them, right? It's really a smaller amount, but they are like really big.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like the projects that actually drove business value are the projects that ultimately had a higher likelihood of success. Not necessarily, hey, we just want to test out AI, or this is some pet project we'll throw a couple resources behind. It was something where the organization actually said this is either going to drive revenue, reduce costs, keep us in compliance, something of that nature.
Totally, yeah. And I think what I would add to that is also that it's usually an existing customer base that a business has, right? If you think of maybe the internet as a counterexample to some extent, or the web in general, where you really also build an audience through being on the web. And there was like an opportunity for people to build whole companies around that, of course. I think with conversational AI, that hasn't happened so much because there's not this like single platform, right? Because in this case, customers already talk to insurance companies. And so you basically want to be wherever they contact you. And it's really the first time you can be where they contact you, which is great. Right. And automate there and like really improve the experience, I think, also for those folks. And I think that has changed a lot in how people view conversational AI, because 3 to 4 years ago, there was a lot of debate around like, should there be like an app store for chatbots?
Okay.
Which kind of makes sense, right? Because if you look at the mobile ecosystem, in hindsight, the App Store really made like distribution so much easier and much easier for consumers to discover those apps in this case, right?
Right.
And that I think wasn't as important for conversational AI, because you could argue that Alexa and Google Home, there are some sort of app stores or like bot stores, I guess, if you will. But they haven't really solved that problem, because it's not so much about discovery, because you already probably call your insurance company or your bank. And so that discovery piece is easy, but you want to make the experience really great. And that's where we come back to your initial question around like, why did these bots fail? I think just because a lot of them offered a really, really poor customer experience in the early days.
Yeah. And was it more about, if you think about experience, and I put in my first few kind of lines of text to communicate with this chatbot, is it more so that my question wasn't answered, or was it more so that the answer felt very much like a bot, or maybe even a combination of both?
I think it's more the first point. So like the question wasn't really answered. I like, from my experience, people are fine with talking with a robot in this case, as long as this robot provides them what they need, right? And I think that what they need goes also probably like in two ways. Like one is just an answer to whatever question they ask, right? And being able to understand what they ask is like a whole AI/ML challenge. We can probably not go too much into the detail today, but that's super hard to do, right? And it became much easier over the last 4 years, but it's still hard. And so understanding that is one. The other one is solving that problem. Because the way how I look at it is, usually if you call your insurance company, let's take that as an example again, you don't want an answer, you really want something to get done, right?
Yep.
Normally. And so that getting things done is actually also really hard to do, because all of those like large companies, they don't have the simple API to I don't know, do a claims process, or I don't know, change your address or update your phone number, right? It's like still pretty manual actually for a lot of those. And so connecting that into your backend is something that also we find like customers investing a lot into, and it makes a lot of sense.
Super helpful. What are some of the most valuable use cases for conversational AI that you're seeing today, or even just some that you would like to highlight because they're interesting?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I, for some reason, just lost connectivity. I'm sorry, Darius.
Oh yeah, no worries. I was curious about, you got a tool to help people to build and deploy these conversational AI applications. I'm curious about some of the use cases that you've seen where you're like, wow, that's really innovative, or wow, that creates a lot of value.
Yeah, great question. So the big one, and it's really like the elephant in the room, is contact center, I would say. And that comes in like anything that is voice-based, so more like telephony, as well as asynchronous messaging, right? You probably have been chatting with a brand on Facebook Messenger, or maybe, I don't know, iMessage even. Some of them have that. And then those chats can be human-powered or assistant-powered, right? And the same for calling a company in the same way. And those are, I think, the obvious ones. And every company thinks about it a little differently, but it's really boiling down to the same problem to be solved there. So that's exciting and big. But then there are lots of others that we also think are super exciting. And I think one that I'm personally really bullish on is anything around like supporting an existing product being easier to use, right? And so if you think of maybe Adobe Photoshop or so as an example, if you could make it easier to use a tool like Photoshop, for example, for folks that might not have deep training in it, that's super exciting because you really lower the bar for anyone to get started with that. So for example, think of changing the brightness of an image or something like that, right? If you ever use Photoshop, it's like somewhere hidden in some toolbar. And it's just an example, right? But there's so many other ways to use a product, or Excel, or whatever like complicated product. Salesforce is my favorite example because we are now over 70 people and run a fairly large company already. And so for me, like finding anything in Salesforce, like a report, is super tricky, right? And so I end up still writing somebody on the team to help me generate that report. And it's hard to get that right, of course, right? But just to give you a sense for that. And then the third big category is anything internal. So if you think about like HR processes, maybe asking for vacation, right? Like making that in a conversation could be something interesting. And anything around finance, and I mean, IT help desk is another big one. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's super helpful. And then Rasa, where does Rasa step in? What are the tools that are provided? And then if you think about, right, this ML pipeline all the way, beginning at data collection to delivering some prediction, right? Where does Rasa fit in kind of in that pipeline?
So I try to think of conversational AI a bit similar to how we would think about like a web application. Like it doesn't exactly work, but maybe it helps you in the audience to grasp it a little better. And so in the web, you also have a lot of like infrastructure, of course, right? Basically, the simplest way to look at this might be like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, like just super simplified, of course. And then you have tools on top, right? And you might have something like WordPress as an example to actually build a website or web application. And then you have a lot of other things. You have all these easy to use website builders and all that. And so Rasa is really like the HTML, if you will, for conversational AI. And so that comes with all the things that you need to build conversational AI from an infrastructure standpoint, meaning you know how to understand text and basically translate that into understand the intention behind what somebody said. And I come to the data piece in a second. And then you have a whole dialogue management, which is more about what to do next. So once you understood what somebody said, you want to figure out what to do next, right? And that next step could be to check a database, or it could be to ask another question or something like that. And then the third piece is really the actual response. And so here, the response right now is very much scripted. So we don't use any like fancy machine learning there. And it's mostly also because it's what not like most companies just don't want any fancy machine learning there. And they want fancy machine learning at the beginning of understanding, and then also the dialogue management. So that's just to give you a sense for the different components that we offer. And then we have much more tooling around empowering also teams that work together to build these assistants to be more effective. And then on the data side, what usually happens is that large companies come with like millions of chat transcripts or something like that and say, look, here are millions of chat transcripts. Let's just automate it. And although this sounds tempting, we usually don't recommend that. And so the reason for that is a bit, if you think about how you would train your agent in a call center, you would probably also not go and say, like, here are thousands of conversations, just read through them. Why don't you just come up with responses? And so as much as this is really tempting, and I get it, we take more the side of like, hey, you're actually building a product here, and your users talking with this chatbot will probably respond a little different than they would do talking to a human agent, right? And so that's already a big difference. So why don't you just go and start with something super simple and then learn from there? And we call it like conversation-driven development. And the idea is really like you can literally listen to what your customers say and then learn from that and improve the assistant over time instead of doing lots of data collection before and labeling and all of that. Because we find this doesn't really get you there. I mean, it's good to identify use cases, but it's not that great for actually building an assistant.
Yeah. So for the actual response, so let me back up here. They kind of be starting from zero, and then a question comes in. What's the response going to be with that question? And you start building up your data set from there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Was it very manual in the beginning, or?
It's quite manual, but it's actually something that we find is extremely important because and that goes back to one of the insights that my co-founder and I had 4.5 years ago. So Alan would build a chatbot, right? And then he would turn the computer around and let me type something and play around with it, right? And so it never worked because even though I knew the use case, I've thought about it in a very different way, right? I might just use different words. I had a different logic of how I approached it. So the point is basically you can never know what your users will actually say.
Yeah.
Until you let them talk. But the challenge there is then if you, of course, roll this out to millions of customers, you get a lot of data in, right? Which is a whole other topic that we are solving with our enterprise product. But yeah, that's generally the idea. Start small and then expand from there.
Yeah, it also reminds me of the QA process where you got a developer, built a product. You're not necessarily going to use the developer to test the product because they'll test it in the way that they built it, right? But if you have someone from QA do it, they're going to test it in a different way. And then, hey, actually, here's a bug. We need to fix this. And then you got the customer, when they test it, it's still a different way that they're going to use the software, which then you have to go fix other things. Now, is there an AI component to what you had, behind Rasa, right? What are you all leveraging AI to do?
So there's lots of super heavy lifting going on behind the scenes. And Rasa in general is mostly built on top of TensorFlow, deep learning framework by Google. And really the idea is for us to abstract away a lot of the super heavy machine learning lifting and AI stuff that happens, but still allow our users, which are predominantly developers, to tweak the underlying infrastructure if they want to. So it's starting with the right defaults, and then you can still tweak around, if you will. And that's just on the infrastructure side. And then we're working on a lot of other things more around what I just mentioned with, for example, discovering which conversations didn't work out between the assistant or the chatbot and the user, right? That's a huge topic that we're really interested in. So many other things that need to be solved in this space. But I think in the end, what we find is that to really build a great assistant, you need AI ML, and we give you all of that, but that's not all, right? That's in order to really make it a great customer experience, you just won't be able to just do AI ML and throw that at your customers and that's it, right? Because integration is another example there, right? As I mentioned, really deeply integrating something into your backend makes all the difference. Because if you call your bank and you say, hey, I lost my credit card. Can I get a new one? And you talk to a chatbot or like a voice assistant in this case, you can get a response of saying, hey, open your app. And I don't know, and maybe you also lost your phone, right? Or whatever. And so you actually, in this case, really want to have a new credit card. And so you want to have a conversation about that, where you are, maybe you're in a different hotel, maybe your address changed, you have to authenticate, all of those things. And doing that really smoothly is, we think, really important. And that's just not only machine learning.
Right. The integration piece is critical. I guess if you think about building and deploying AI applications, specifically the AI piece, what would you say in your experience or from what you've seen, in the industry as a whole, is the most difficult piece or the biggest problem that folks face in terms of building and deploying AI?
I think it's really a mindset change that has to happen, right? Because in our case, we work a lot, as I mentioned earlier, with like the largest companies in the world. And I think they recently went through a transition, and still are, a lot of them, to really become digital. And I mean, people still talk a lot about digital transformation, and it's probably still ongoing for the next decade or so, right? But in addition to that, I think what has to change for AI/ML applications specifically is this mindset of, you're not building really a static application anymore, but you're building something that kind of evolves over time, right? And with that also comes the mindset that you probably can't always control it, which seems scary, right? I mean, it seems scary to me running a 70-person company, but I think for a lot of like large companies it is. But the benefits of that are huge, right? And so you basically have to change how you really operationalize those projects and initiatives internally. And what I just mentioned earlier, with starting somewhere small, iterating quickly, is of course something that I think everyone would recommend you doing for a mobile app as well. But it's, I think, even more relevant for AI/ML applications. And so as earlier you can throw it out there, I think the better.
Yeah. And you all have abstracted away a lot of that kind of the technical piece that folks would generally have to do. Who's the user, right? Like how technical does a person have to be to then go out and say, hey, look, I'm gonna build a conversational AI app using Rasa?
Yeah, it depends. I think in general, what we see more and more is like really multidisciplinary teams forming. And so what I mean with that is like the same way as for building a mobile app, you would probably have a couple of developers, designers, some content folks, and product managers. That's basically what we see with conversational AI as well. And so in this case, the initial user is a developer, data scientist, or data scientist. And for what we find is like people who build mobile apps and web applications before are fine to get started with Rasa. I mean, they of course over time like learn more about the ML side of things, and we have a lot of like content and education on that as well. But you can get started without being a machine learning expert.
Okay.
So that's on the developer side. And then in conversational AI, basically another big role is conversation designers. So those are folks that think through how a conversation should look like, right? And that's something that we actually don't provide as a tool. There are a couple of other companies in the space, like VoiceFlow is an example, Botmock and Bot Society. So they provide basically the Photoshop, if you will, for conversational AI. And then there are really the content specialists. So people that are very deep into a certain domain, like claims processes, for example. And those are users of our product as well.
Yeah, very interesting, especially that conversational design piece. I guess if you have a niche, right? If I'm in a niche industry, do you suggest bringing, all right, before you use Rasa, find someone who can help with conversational design, or you can get started first and then bring on someone in conversational design after?
It really depends. Companies do it in all the ways that you just described, right? I think what I generally would recommend is really getting super crystal clear on the use case that you want to build. And then ideally, I mean, I wrote a blog post about this 5 years ago where I suggested basically that instead of building any bot, you can just be the bot yourself. And I mean, it sounds maybe a bit obvious, but if you think of a use case in conversational AI, the best way to prove it out, if it actually will work and resonate with your customers, is to just pretend to be a chatbot.
Yeah.
And I mean, companies, of course, do that at scale in like contact centers. And I'm not saying that they pretend to be a chatbot, but they have a lot of data around that. Like what could be use cases for a chatbot and to start with. But I think that's really the best way to get going. And then I think conversational design normally comes in as a second phase after like an initial proof of concept.
Got it. Okay. And I know we got to be conscious of time here, but I got a couple more questions for you, but these will be more quick fire questions for you. So if you think about tooling, right? Favorite tech tool, not Rasa. I'm speaking in Spanish, not Rasa. What would be your favorite tech tool?
That's a great question. I mean, so many, but I think I would say probably Todoist is my favorite.
Okay, why is that?
It's just, has been really solid and great and supportive for the last 5 years or so since I've been using it. And I think they just really understand my workflows. So without ever talking to them.
Nice. Okay. And then one person who's inspired you either in AI or in business in general?
Also a great question. Many people, I mean, specifically for Rasa, we had the huge, fortunate to just work with a lot of amazing open source founders. Like Ross Mason, the founder of MuleSoft, is a good example. Who has been angel and Rasa, huge supporter along the way. So there are many folks like that. When I think about generally companies that I admire, I definitely like Stripe, I think is huge on my list. And I think they just did a great job at navigating this developer space, but then also really talking about the business value of the product that they built in a really authentic way. So
yeah, very interesting. And it sounds like you have some content where folks can go back, learn more, kind of pick your brain a little bit more about the space. Where can we find you? Where should we go?
Yeah, a great question. In terms of Rasa, rasa.com is the place to start. And we have a ton of education material for developers specifically, but also more and more for these content specialists, for example, and other folks as well in the future. And we have YouTube content, a huge Rasa masterclass, which is amazing and have been viewed over, I think, 200,000 times at this point in time. So that's for Rasa. And for me personally, just find me on LinkedIn and just connect there and reach out. I can't promise to always respond quickly. I'm always a little bit behind when it comes to LinkedIn, but otherwise, I'm sure you'll find a way to reach me.
Are you on Twitter?
I'm also on Twitter, yeah. But I'm not as active on Twitter as I wish I would.
Okay. Yeah. We'll make sure we get you linked up on what you mentioned when this goes live. So Alex, thanks for taking time out. This was super helpful in terms of understanding the conversational AI space, open source, and what you guys have built today. I think it's super interesting how you pivoted your way to a great idea. So again, thanks. And we'll have to have you back for an update soon.
Yeah, sounds great. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure and great stuff that you're putting together there with the podcast.
Absolutely.
Really exciting.
I appreciate it. I appreciate that feedback.